Either one of us wants to go back. I don't think that would happen again. It wouldn't happen.
David Gilmore, the legendary guitarist and voice of Pink Floyd, has always carried an air of mystery. Known for his soaring solos and calm presence on stage, Gilmour rarely made headlines for personal feuds or public outbursts. He seemed, at least to fans, above the chaos of rock and roll drama. But beneath that quiet exterior was a man with sharp opinions, someone who cared deeply about music and wasn't afraid to call out artists who, in his view, betrayed its essence. Now, at 79, as the world reflects on his remarkable career, a surprising truth has emerged. David Gilmour did, in fact, harbor strong dislikes for certain musicians, and when he finally revealed the names of the 6 artists he couldn't stand, fans were stunned. This wasn't petty rivalry or baseless resentment. It was the raw honesty of a man who spent decades perfecting his craft and wasn't willing to overlook what he saw as arrogance, dishonesty, or mediocrity in others. Some of the names will shock you. They include iconic figures, celebrated bands, and even musicians who once claimed inspiration from Gilmour himself. Yet each choice reveals something about his character, his respect for authenticity, his hatred of ego-driven showmanship, and his refusal to tolerate those who treated music as anything less than sacred. In this documentary, we'll uncover the 6 musicians David Gilmour truly despised, exploring not just the reasons behind his disdain, but also what these revelations say about the man himself. Because sometimes the artists we admire the most are defined as much by what they reject as by what they archival footage of David Gilmour on stage in the mid-1970s. His eyes closed as he bends a single note that lingers like a cry. The narrator's voice cuts through softly, setting the stage. For decades, David Gilmour was considered one of the calmest, most composed figures in rock. He wasn't one for public fights or flashy rivalries. But when he spoke, people listened. And in his rare but unflinching criticisms, 2 names stood out as musicians he could never quite forgive. The first was Roger Waters, his longtime Pink Floyd bandmate and perhaps his greatest creative rival. Their clash is the stuff of rock legend. Gilmour admired Waters' lyricism and ambition, but he despised the ego and control that came with it. As Pink Floyd's albums grew more conceptual, Animals, The Wall, Waters increasingly dominated the band's vision, often leaving little room for collaboration. Gilmour felt suffocated. To him, music was about balance, harmony, and emotional depth. Waters, in Gilmour's eyes, turned it into a platform for personal power and political agendas. The bitterness between the two wasn't just professional, it was deeply personal. And though fans still dream of reconciliations, Gilmour made it clear many times, some wounds never fully heal. The second musician he openly disdained was Axl Rose, frontman of Guns N' Roses. While the band stormed the rock world with raw energy, Gilmour saw little artistry behind the chaos. To him, Rose's notorious outbursts, late appearances, and public feuds embodied everything wrong with modern rock stardom. Gilmour valued discipline and respect for the craft. Axl, in contrast, seemed to thrive on recklessness and controversy. Once, Gilmour even remarked that he had no time for bands who mistake arrogance for talent. While he didn't name Rose directly in that comment, those close to him knew exactly who he was referring to. Both cases reveal a lot about Gilmour's philosophy. He hated ego, whether it came from inside his own band or from the next generation of rock stars. For him, the music was always bigger than the individual, and when musicians put themselves above the art, they lost his respect completely. Cut to clips of Roger Waters on stage during the Wall tour. His commanding presence contrasted with Gilmour's understated grace. Then cut again to footage of Axl Rose storming across the stage, sunglasses on, defiance in every move. The stories of Roger Waters and Axl Rose may seem worlds apart, but for David Gilmour, they carried the same theme, music tainted by ego. And if there was one thing he despised most, it was the kind of arrogance that overshadowed the beauty of the art itself. 8. Early 1990s footage of David Gilmour walking through his Sussex home studio, adjusting knobs on vintage amplifiers. His voice in interviews is calm, deliberate. But when asked about modern rock, there's a sharp edge in his honesty. By the 1990s, David Gilmore had already cemented his place as one of rock's most respected guitarists. He wasn't chasing fame anymore. He was defending the integrity of music itself. And while he rarely named names, his criticisms of certain musicians were unmistakable. Two of them, both adored by millions, stood out as particular targets of his disdain. The third name on his list was Sid Vicious, the bassist of the Sex Pistols. To Gilmour, Sid wasn't just untalented. He was the very embodiment of what he despised about punk rock. Sid couldn't play his instrument properly, had little interest in learning, and yet became a cultural icon. For Gilmour, who had spent years honing his craft, this was unforgivable. He saw Sid as proof that hype and image could overshadow talent, and it infuriated him. To Gilmour, music was sacred, a calling that required respect, discipline, and dedication. Sid's chaotic life, fueled by drugs and self-destruction, mocked everything Gilmour stood for. The fourth musician was Ted Nugent, a guitar player known more for his outspoken personality and controversial statements than his actual playing. Nugent was loud, brash, and politically charged, the complete opposite of Gilmour's understated elegance. Gilmour had no patience for musicians who used their platform for provocation rather than artistry. While Nugent loved to remind audiences of his supposed guitar genius, Gilmour found his work shallow compared to the emotional resonance music could carry. He once hinted in an interview that he detested showmen who confused noise with meaning, and fans widely interpreted this as a jab at Nugent. Both choices reveal a common thread. Gilmour despised pretenders. Sid Vicious, in his eyes, symbolized incompetence masked by rebellion. Ted Nugent represented ego and showmanship dressed up as artistry. Neither, in Gilmour's opinion, respected music for what it truly was. A vessel for expression and connection. Cut to archival footage, Sid Vicious thrashing a bass wildly on stage, followed by Ted Nugent pacing furiously during interviews, his voice booming. Contrasted with Gilmour sitting quietly with his guitar, eyes closed, lost in tone. It wasn't that Gilmour hated experimentation or rebellion. After all, Pink Floyd had been pioneers of both. What he couldn't stand was when music became a stage for personality over passion, for gimmick over craft. With Sid and Nugent, he saw two men who, despite their fame, had lost sight of the music itself. And for Gilmour, that was the greatest sin of all, black and white clips of Pink Floyd rehearsing in the 1970s. Gilmour sits quietly in the corner, guitar on his lap, saying little. The narrator's voice rises with intrigue. By the turn of the millennium, David Gilmour had grown into the role of elder statesman in rock music. He was measured, reflective, and deliberate with his words, but he never shied away from telling the truth as he saw it. And when it came to certain musicians, his patience was non-existent. Two final names completed his list of the artists he openly despised. The fifth musician was Gene Simmons, co-founder of Kiss. Much like his bandmate Paul Stanley, Simmons had built a career on theatrics, fire-breathing, and selling the idea of rock stardom rather than the music itself. To many, Kiss were larger-than-life icons. To Gilmour, they were businessmen in costumes. He criticized Simmons' obsession with branding, the toys, the merchandise, the endless commercialization of music. For a man like Gilmour, who believed music should be pure expression, this felt like an insult. In interviews, he dismissed bands who turned rock into a factory, and though he didn't say Simmons' name outright, everyone knew who he meant. The sixth name was more surprising: Eric Clapton. Fans might assume two legendary guitarists would share mutual respect. But for Gilmour, Clapton represented a kind of arrogance he couldn't abide. While he admired Clapton's skill, he disliked the way Clapton carried himself, distant, aloof, and at times politically controversial. Gilmour once remarked that virtuosity without humility means very little. Insiders believe this was a direct reference to Clapton. It wasn't that Gilmour denied Clapton's talent, far from it. But he resented the way Clapton seemed to treat music as a pedestal for himself rather than a bridge to others. With Simmons and Clapton, Gilmour's judgments came into full focus. It wasn't about genre, popularity, or even technical skill. It was about respect for the art. Gene Simmons cheapened music by turning it into a business empire. Eric Clapton, in Gilmour's eyes, cheapened it by letting ego overshadow the gift itself. Cut to archival footage. Simmons signing Kiss lunchboxes and action figures in the 1980s, juxtaposed with Clapton's cool, detached demeanor in interviews. Then contrast it with Gilmour quietly strumming Wish You Were Here in his home studio, the very picture of sincerity. By naming these musicians, Gilmour wasn't looking to stir controversy or spark headlines. He was making a statement, one he'd lived by for decades. Music was sacred. It wasn't to be sold like a toy, and it wasn't to be wielded like a weapon of ego. It was something higher, something purer, something perhaps divine. A wide aerial view of David Gilmour's Sussex home, where he spent his later years surrounded by guitars, amplifiers, and the quiet serenity of the countryside. The narrator's voice softens, carrying a tone of reflection. When David Gilmour finally revealed the 6 musicians he truly hated, Roger Waters, Axl Rose, Sid Vicious, Ted Nugent, Gene Simmons, and Eric Clapton, fans were stunned. Some names made sense, others felt like shocks. But taken together, they painted a vivid picture of what mattered most to him, not just as a guitarist, but as a man. What connects these 6 names isn't style or genre. They come from different corners of rock: progressive, punk, glam, hard rock, and blues. What unites them, in Gilmour's eyes, is a lack of authenticity. To him, music was never about theater, scandal, or ego. It was about truth. And when an artist betrayed that, whether by arrogance, chaos, commercialization, or indifference, they lost his respect. His feud with Roger Waters, perhaps the most personal of all, showed his hatred of domination and control. Axl Rose embodied reckless arrogance. Sid Vicious represented the triumph of image over skill. Ted Nugent twisted music into provocation. Gene Simmons turned it into a business empire. And Eric Clapton, though immensely talented, allowed ego to overshadow humility. Through his dislikes, we see Gilmour's philosophy more clearly than ever. Music to him was sacred. It was a spiritual act, a way of channeling emotion, honesty, and connection. Anything that corrupted that, be it greed, ego, or carelessness, was something he could never forgive. Cut to archival clips. Gilmour sitting quietly in Abbey Road Studios. His voice gentle as he talks about recording Shine On You Crazy Diamond. The narrator continues. But here's the irony. In naming those he despised, Gilmour also revealed what he loved. He loved discipline. He loved humility. He loved the kind of artistry that made a single note mean more than 1,000 words. His playing reflected his values. Every bend, every sustain, every whisper of sound carried integrity. And that is why fans adored him. At 79, Gilmour's words carried the weight of a lifetime. He wasn't seeking revenge, and he wasn't trying to shock anyone. He was simply honest. And that honesty, even when harsh, was what made him who he was. Closing montage, Gilmour performing Comfortably Numb in the early 2000s. The camera lingering on his face as he loses himself in the music. The narrator delivers the final line. In the end, the musicians David Gilmour hated say just as much about him as the music he loved. His disdain was never about rivalry. It was about respect for the craft, for the listener, and for the sacred power of song. And perhaps that is the greatest lesson he leaves us with, that music, at its best, is truth. And truth, no matter how uncomfortable, is what David Gilmour lived for.